She flew higher than any woman before her, and closer to evil than she ever imagined. Hanna Reitsch, the fearless pilot of Hitler's Air Force, risked everything for the sky. Was she a hero, a victim, or something far darker? Subscribe and witness the true story unfold. She was 5 years old when she first saw an airplane. It came roaring over the hills of Silesia like a silver bird made of thunder. While others covered their ears, she ran toward the sound, eyes wide, heart pounding. That day, Hanna Reitsch decided she would fly, no matter what it took. In 1912, the world was still stitched together by horses and smoke, but Hanna dreamed of clouds and engines. She was small, fragile even, but her mind was fierce. She climbed trees, studied birds, and read every scrap of paper about flight she could find. Her parents, a doctor and a strict Prussian mother, tried to guide her toward medicine. But Hanna was drawn to the wind. At school, she would sit by the window staring at the sky instead of the chalkboard. When teachers asked what she wanted to be, she answered without hesitation. "A pilot." They laughed. Girls were supposed to nurse, not fly. But Hanna didn't laugh. By the time she reached her 20s, Germany had changed. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled its air force, but a new regime was rising, one that promised glory in the sky again. Hanna, now a medical student, saw her chance. She joined a glider club, the only kind of flying Germany was allowed, and soon became a sensation. She learned to fly on the cliffs of the Riesengebirge Mountains, using nothing but wind and courage. Each launch was a leap of faith. No engine, no guarantee of return, just silence, air, and instinct. In 1931, she won her first competition, landing perfectly after hours in the air. The men who doubted her now applauded. The newspapers called her the flying girl of Germany, but Hanna wanted more. She didn't just want to glide, she wanted power, engines, speed. So she applied to the German Research Institute for Aviation. They rejected her at first. A woman among test pilots was unthinkable. But Hanna showed up anyway, day after day, until they gave her a chance. Her determination cracked the concrete of convention. By 1934, Germany's secret rearmament was in full motion. The Luftwaffe was being rebuilt in silence. New planes, new technologies, new symbols, all cloaked in patriotism. And in the middle of it, this small, bright-eyed woman was climbing into cockpits meant for men. Her instructors quickly realized that Hanna had something rare. She didn't flinch. Not when engines failed, not when planes spun out, not even when wings cracked under pressure. She could feel the air, as if the wind itself spoke to her. One afternoon, while testing a prototype glider, a cable snapped mid-launch. The craft spiraled downward, crashing into a frozen field. When rescuers arrived, they found Hanna crawling from the wreckage, blood on her face, smiling. "The controls worked," she said softly. "The fault was in the tow line, not the design." That calm precision impressed everyone, including the rising officials of the Third Reich. They loved symbols, and Hanna was perfect, disciplined, loyal, photogenic, and fearless. By 1935, she was invited to join the Luftwaffe's test program. Her task, to fly the newest, most dangerous aircraft before anyone else dared. She didn't hesitate. The uniform fit her like armor, but something deeper was happening inside her, a shift she didn't yet understand. She wasn't just serving Germany anymore. She was serving an idea, a vision of perfection, of conquest disguised as patriotism. Still, in her mind, she flew for the sky, not for the swastika. The early test flights were brutal. Engines exploded, wings tore off, pilots died almost weekly. But Hanna kept flying. When she crashed, she refused morphine, insisting on walking out of wreckage herself. She broke bones, dislocated her jaw, and lost teeth, but returned to the cockpit. Her colleagues began to whisper that she had no fear of death. They were wrong. She felt fear every time the wheels left the ground. But she also felt something greater, the intoxicating freedom of flight. At night, she would write in her journal, "Up there, the air has no politics, only purity. The earth below carries the madness. The sky remains innocent." In 1937, Hanna's skill brought her to national fame. She set records for altitude and distance, winning the Iron Cross, one of the only women to do so. Photographers adored her. Newsreels showed her stepping from aircraft with perfect poise, waving to cheering crowds. To the world, she was Germany's angel of the skies. To the regime, she was proof that their empire could elevate even a woman, as long as she served their vision. To herself, she was just Hanna, chasing the wind that had called to her since childhood. As Europe trembled on the edge of war, she didn't see the danger below. She saw only cloud and beyond them destiny. When she looked up that summer evening, the sky over Berlin burned orange with sunset and smoke from new factories. The wind carried the faint hum of bombers being tested somewhere far away. Hanna smiled, unaware that her wings and forged-in dreams were about to carry her straight into the heart of the Reich. By 1938, Hanna Reitsch had become a legend. The newspapers called her the daredevil of the Reich, the fearless woman who flew anything with wings, even machines that terrified men twice her size. To the German public, she was a symbol of pride and progress, the perfect fusion of courage and beauty. To the Luftwaffe, she was a secret weapon of propaganda. Every week she tested a new aircraft, gliders, bombers, fighters, even helicopters that barely existed outside of blueprints. She was small enough to fit inside the cramped prototypes, her hands steady, her focus absolute. When others hesitated, Hanna volunteered. "If a machine can fly, I will make it fly," she told her engineers. They laughed nervously, but she meant it. Her first major test came with the Fokker-Achilles F-61, the world's first functional helicopter. It was little more than a spinning death trap of rotors and noise. Yet Hanna climbed in, strapped herself down, and lifted off. The aircraft wobbled violently, swaying like a drunk bird, but she held it steady. Within minutes, she was circling above the hangar, eyes shining. When she landed, she jumped out, breathless. "It's like dancing with the wind," she said. The engineers stared, half in awe, half in disbelief. A few months later, she performed a public flight demonstration inside the massive Berlin Deutschlandhalle. The crowds gasped as the helicopter hovered inches from the ceiling. Hitler himself sent her a telegram of praise. Hanna became the face of German aviation, her image printed on postcards, her smile on magazine covers. But fame never satisfied her. What thrilled her wasn't applause, it was danger. When the Luftwaffe began testing rocket-powered aircraft, Hanna was the first to volunteer. The Messerschmitt Me-163. Komet was a beast, a sleek, unstable, fuel-loaded rocket that could climb faster than any plane alive, and explode just as quickly. Its takeoffs were legendary and fatal. In 1942, Hanna climbed into one for the first time. She wore a silver flight suit, her blonde hair tied tightly, her expression calm. As the engines ignited, the plane leapt forward like lightning. Within seconds, it was climbing at 600 miles per hour. The G-forces crushed her chest, her vision darkened, and for a moment she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. But she held on, then disaster. The engine failed mid-flight. The Komet turned into a falling comet, spiraling out of control. Ground crews watched in horror as it smashed into the ground in a cloud of dust and flame. When they reached the wreck, Hanna was barely alive, her nose broken, her skull fractured, her face soaked in blood. But when she opened her eyes, the first words she whispered were, "Did they record the flight data?" Even the doctors couldn't believe it. She survived again. A few weeks later, still bandaged, she returned to flying. Hitler awarded her the Iron Cross First Class, one of the highest honors given to a civilian, and almost unheard of for a woman. The photo of that moment, Hanna standing before him, smiling faintly, the medal pinned to her chest, became an icon. To some it was courage. To others it was complicity. As the war deepened, Hanna's name grew darker. The Luftwaffe began using her image in posters, the spirit of the new Germany. She never gave speeches about politics, but she appeared beside men who did. Behind the camera, she felt unease. She didn't see ideology. She saw flying machines. But history would never separate the two. At night, she would visit the hangar alone. The air smelled of fuel and metal. She would run her fingers along the wings of the test planes and whisper to herself, "They only remember the pilots when they crash." The engineers started calling her Iron Wings, not because of her planes, but because of her will. She had flown through more wrecks than most pilots could count. She bore scars across her face, ribs that never healed right, and hands that trembled when cold. But she still smiled for the cameras. In private, she wrote, "If I must die, let it be in the air. The ground is not for me." By 1943, her name was inseparable from the Luftwaffe's myth. a myth that would soon collide with reality, as the war she helped symbolize began to devour everything, even those who had once soared above it. By 1944, Germany was burning. The Allies ruled the skies and the once invincible Luftwaffe was crumbling. Factories lay in ruins, cities smoldered, and still the propaganda reels played, showing smiling pilots and gleaming aircraft. And in those reels, one face appeared again and again, Hanna Reitsch, the iron wings of the Reich. But behind the curtain of glory was a growing madness. Berlin's engineers were designing weapons not for victory, but for vengeance. Flying bombs, guided missiles, aircraft that promised miracles but delivered fire. And Hanna, the nation's most fearless pilot, was called to test them. The first was the V-1, a pulse jet missile nicknamed the Buzz Bomb. It was supposed to fly unmanned, carrying a ton of explosives across the channel to London, but early versions failed. Engines sputtered, wings broke, guidance systems failed. Someone had to fly one, to understand it. That someone was Hanna. When she arrived at the testing field in Peenemünde, the air smelled of salt and gasoline. The V-1 prototype sat on its rail, sleek, small, and sinister. It looked more like a coffin than a plane. Her colleagues warned her, "If the pulse jet cuts out, you won't have time to bail." Hanna only nodded. They strapped her in. The roar of the engine began, a sound like metal tearing itself apart. The craft shook violently as it launched. For a moment it was airborne. The vibrations rattled her teeth. The cockpit filled with fumes. Her instruments flickered, then a silence. The engine died. The V-1 plummeted, spinning toward the sea. Hanna pulled every lever she could reach. The wings groaned. At the last second, the craft leveled, skimming the waves before slamming into the shore. When they pulled her from the wreck, she was half-conscious, soaked, and laughing weakly. "It flies," she whispered. "It only needs better guidance." Her report saved months of testing and proved the V-1 could be mass-produced. Within weeks, the first waves were launched toward London. Tens of thousands died. For Hanna, it was a triumph of engineering, but a wound to her soul. She wrote later, "We believed we were saving Germany, but the sky had become a place of murder." Not long after, she was summoned again, this time to test a manned version of the V-1, a suicide aircraft, designed for pilots who would not return. Even many officers refused to touch it. But Hanna listened in silence as the generals explained. They wanted her to prove it could fly, and to help recruit volunteers. She said yes. The project was called Reichenberg. The cockpit was tiny, barely large enough for her small frame. The engine screamed like a banshee when lit. There was no landing gear, only a promise that the pilot would die on impact. Still, Hanna climbed in. When the craft launched, it rocketed forward with unbearable force. The control stick bucked wildly, the nose dipped, and the horizon vanished in a blur. She fought to steady it, pushing herself against the seat, her vision tunneling from the G-forces. At 400 miles per hour, the plane became a blur of vibration and noise. But she held it level, long enough to prove it could be flown, then she ejected. The parachute opened just as the Reichenberg exploded below her. The blast scorched her boots and tore her sleeve, but she survived once more. When she returned, the officers were stunned. They wanted her to help lead the new suicide unit, but for the first time, Hanna refused. "Germany needs heroes," she said quietly, "not martyrs." Her defiance angered some and confused others. To Hitler's followers, dying for him was the highest honor. To Hanna, it was a waste of life, a betrayal of the sky she loved. Still, she continued to fly, to test, to obey orders. Her loyalty was no longer faith. It was inertia, a motion she couldn't stop. The war had consumed her purpose, but not her instinct. At night, she sat in her quarters, watching the firebombs glowing on the horizon. In her journal, she wrote, "They told me I was the spirit of Germany, but I see only ghosts." By early 1945, she was exhausted, haunted, and yet still unbroken. The world below was collapsing, and soon the woman who once danced with the wind would walk straight into the heart of its final storm. By March 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of smoke and silence. The Allies were closing in from every direction. Buildings burned day and night, and the sky that Hanna once loved had turned into a black cage of falling bombs. She could hear them even inside her quarters, the deep rhythmic pounding that made the walls shake. And then came the summons. Reichsführer demands your presence. Immediately. She was to fly to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain stronghold. It was a journey into the heart of a dying empire. When she arrived, the air was thin and cold. The once grand halls of the Berghof were nearly empty. Uniforms no longer shone. Faces were hollow, eyes red from sleepless nights. And yet, in that hollow silence, there was still a kind of ritual, people saluting ghosts, speaking to phantoms of victory. Then she saw him. Adolf Hitler, standing by a large map, his hand trembling, eyes sunken. The man who had once commanded millions now looked smaller than the shadow he cast. But when Hanna entered, he turned, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "Ah, my little flyer," he said softly. "Germany still has brave hearts." She saluted, though the gesture felt heavier than ever before. They spoke for nearly an hour. Hitler asked about the new aircraft, the suicide project, the morale of the pilots. His questions were calm, almost gentle. But his words carried the fever of delusion. He still believed victory was possible, if only his people were strong enough to die for him. "They do not understand sacrifice," he murmured. "Do they, Hanna?" She hesitated. The truth was burning in her throat, but she could not say it, and not here, not to him. "They fight bravely, mein Führer," she said. He nodded slowly. "You must show them what it means to believe." Then came the question that froze her blood. He wanted her to fly a plane into the heart of Berlin, to prove that even in ruin, faith could still take flight. A symbolic mission. A suicide. For a long moment, Hanna said nothing. The crackle of the fireplace filled the silence. Finally, she looked at him and said quietly, "If it will serve Germany, I will do it." Hitler's eyes softened. He placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. "You are the embodiment of our spirit," he said. "Pure, fearless, eternal." But as she left the room, the words echoed like a curse. That night, she couldn't sleep. The mountain wind howled outside the window, carrying the faint smell of snow and smoke. She stared at her hands, scarred, calloused, trembling. She had spent her life chasing the wind. Now, it was chasing her. The next morning, she met with General von Gramm, the Luftwaffe's last surviving commander. He had been ordered to fly into besieged Berlin, to take command from within the chaos. It was a mission few would return from. And Hanna, without hesitation, volunteered to accompany him. "You cannot go," Gramm said. "It's suicide." "Then we'll die together," she replied. On April 26, 1945, with the city in flames and Russian artillery pounding the outskirts, Hanna Reitsch and Gramm climbed into a small Fieseler Storch aircraft. The runway was little more than a dirt road surrounded by wreckage. Shells exploded nearby. As they lifted off, the plane shook violently. Smoke filled the cockpit. Below them, Berlin burned, rivers of fire winding through streets that had once been full of life. "Hold on," she shouted over the noise. "We're going in." They flew through the flak, through tracer fire, through clouds of black smoke that smelled of fuel and death. At 3,000 feet, the engine sputtered. She gritted her teeth and pulled the control stick hard, guiding the crippled plane toward the Tiergarten. They touched down under fire, the landing gear snapping on impact. But they had made it. They were inside the city, and deep beneath the ruined chancellery, waiting for them, was the man she had once sworn to follow, now entombed in his final bunker. When Hanna descended into that concrete labyrinth, she could barely breathe. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and despair. The corridors echoed with whispers of cyanide, of surrender, of the end. And in that dim, flickering light, she saw Hitler again. This time he didn't smile. He looked at her for a long moment and simply said, "You have done your duty." Hanna bowed her head. For the first time, she felt no pride, only emptiness. Berlin was dying. From the moment Hanna stepped into the Führer bunker, she knew it. The air was heavy, we were stale with fear, smoke, and sweat. Outside, artillery thundered like the heartbeat of a dying beast. Inside, men whispered lies to one another, pretending the world above still existed. Hanna followed General Grime through the narrow corridors lit by dim bulbs. Every wall was cracked. Every sound echoed. Soldiers and secretaries moved like ghosts, faces pale, uniforms torn, eyes hollow. The once mighty empire now existed only in this underground tomb, and in its center sat Adolf Hitler. Hunched over a table covered in maps, his hands trembled uncontrollably. His voice, once commanding, now rasped with age and rage. "Traitors. All of them," he muttered. "They will pay." When Hanna entered, he looked up. For a moment, his face softened, almost human. "My dear child," he said quietly. "You made it through the fire." She nodded, unable to speak. The sound of shells grew louder, dust falling from the ceiling with each blast. Berlin was collapsing above their heads. That night, she wrote in her diary, "I have seen the end of a world. The bunker smells of death and disbelief. The walls bleed despair. Every hour brought new news of defeat. Russian tanks at the gates, generals surrendering, cities gone. Yet Hitler still spoke of counterattacks that no longer existed. He handed out medals to boys barely 16, eyes wide with terror. Hanna watched in silence, the metal ribbons shaking in his trembling fingers. "You will rebuild the Luftwaffe," he told Grime. "You, Hanna, will help him. Germany will rise again." His words were hollow, yet they struck her heart. She wanted to believe, but the reality outside said otherwise. In the early hours of April 29th, the shelling intensified. The lights flickered. Somewhere above, the chancellery was burning. Hanna sat with the secretaries, Frau Junge, Frau Goebbels, listening to the faint melody of a gramophone playing an old waltz. It sounded obscene against the thunder of artillery. "Do you think we will die here?" one of them whispered. Hanna didn't answer. She looked at her hands again, hands that had touched clouds, engines, wings, and now trembled over a cup of cold coffee. The next day, Hitler called her and Grime to his private room. He looked smaller than ever. His eyes were glassy, his voice almost calm. "I will not be captured," he said. "The world will not have my body." He gave them both cyanide capsules. Then quietly he told them to leave Berlin. "You have done your duty. You must live. Tell the world I was loyal to Germany." Hanna wanted to refuse, to stay, to witness whatever came next, but Grime pulled her away. They saluted one last time. Hitler returned the gesture with a trembling hand. Then they turned and walked out of the room, the door closing behind them like the lid of a coffin. Hours later, the sound of gunfire echoed through the bunker. Someone whispered, "It's over." No one cried. No one spoke. They just sat in silence, listening to the rumble of tanks above and the slow, suffocating collapse of a dream gone mad. Hanna helped Grime to an airfield on the city's outskirts. The ground was scorched, the sky choked with smoke. They found a small Heinkel aircraft still intact. The city glowed red behind them, a burning horizon that once called itself eternal. "Ready?" Grime asked. Hanna looked back one last time. "Let's leave this grave," she said. The plane lifted off through the haze, engines sputtering, wings trembling. Below them, Berlin burned, a sea of fire consuming everything they had once believed in. For the first time, Hanna didn't feel the joy of flight. The wind that had once felt pure now carried only the scent of ashes. And as the city disappeared beneath the clouds, she whispered to herself, "The sky is no longer innocent." The war ended. Germany lay in ruins, a landscape of ashes, silence, and ghosts. For the first time in her life, Hanna Reitsch was grounded. No engines, no uniforms, no wind, only questions. She was captured by the Americans soon after escaping Berlin. When they brought her in, she looked small and frail, her once bright eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. The interrogators expected arrogance or denial. Instead, they found something stranger, calm. She spoke politely even when they called her a symbol of the Nazi regime. She told them everything, Ross, about her flights, the V1, the Komet, the meetings with Hitler. But when asked if she regretted it, she said quietly, "I regret nothing that had to do with flying. The sky never belonged to politics." The Americans couldn't decide if she was honest or just deluded. She spent 15 months in custody. When released, she returned to a Germany that no longer knew her name. The newspapers that once called her the Angel of the Reich now refused to print her picture. She was a relic of a dream everyone wanted to forget. Her family home had been destroyed. Her father had taken his own life rather than surrender to the occupiers. Hanna wandered the countryside, thin and silent, clutching her flight logbooks like holy relics. She wrote in her journal, "I feel like a bird whose wings have been cut, but the wind still calls." In the 1950s, she began to fly again. Gliders, small planes, anything she could find. At air shows, spectators whispered her name but rarely approached. To some, she was still a hero, the first woman to fly a helicopter, the first to pilot a rocket plane. To others, she was the smiling face of evil's machinery. Once, a young reporter asked her if she had known what she was helping to build. Hanna paused for a long time before answering. "We believed we were serving our country. But patriotism is a dangerous drug. It can make you forget who you really serve." In her later years, she became a recluse. She lived quietly in Frankfurt, tending her garden, flying gliders alone on weekends. Friends said she spoke to the wind as if it were a lost companion. She never married, never had children. Her only love had been flight, and even that had betrayed her. In 1979, she set her final record, a glider flight over the Alps that lasted nearly 6 hours. When she landed, a crowd applauded, but Hanna just smiled faintly. "The air is still pure," she said. "It's only we who have changed." She died in 1979 at the age of 67. No one truly knows how. Some say it was natural causes. Others whisper she took her own life, the same way she had lived and in control, on her own terms. At her funeral, a small group of pilots gathered to honor her. No speeches, no flags, just the sound of a single glider passing overhead, silent, graceful, alone. Hanna Reitsch remains a paradox, a woman who soared higher than anyone thought possible, yet never escaped the shadow of the world she served. Was she a monster, a victim, or simply a dreamer born in the wrong century? Perhaps even she never knew. But one thing is certain. When history remembers the war's machines, somewhere in that memory, a small figure will always stand at the cockpit, eyes lifted toward the light, whispering to the wind that once carried her beyond fear, beyond duty, beyond redemption.